at University of North Carolina in Greensboro. And Michael gained his PhD from Purdue University. His research focuses on teaching personal and social responsibility through sport, physical activity, and physical education, and specifically interested in urban communities and professional development programs for physical activity providers. And his PhD dissertation study was recognized with the International Young Scholar Award in the ISEP conference in 2011, which is where I first met Michael. And I've been lucky to see him at a few conferences over the years. We're going to pass control of the meeting over to Michael now, and he'll get his slides set up for you. And we should have some time afterwards for some questions. I'll mute now and pass over to Michael. Off you go.
Okay, confirmation, you can hear me and see the slide.
Perfect, thanks, Michael.
Great. So thank you. I have to start out by just saying I wish I were there at University of Bedfordshire, but I've been assured that we can table that visit to a more appropriate time. But this is certainly an honor for me to come to this seminar, and one of the nice surprises about the pandemic is we've been able to connect across shores in different ways. So I'm excited for that. And let me pause one more time. I'm seeing the waiting room. Is someone else able to monitor that, or should I respond to that?
Sorry, Michael. If you disable the waiting room for us and then people can just come in then. Sorry, I meant to do that just before.
Yeah, just a second. Okay, I think I may have had that, but we'll see.
Thank you.
Okay, so thanks again for this invitation. I'm just very excited to be here. I want to start off with an acknowledgement, just reflective of my thinking on restorative justice. It's important to acknowledge that we are in a global pandemic, and it's causing a lot of harm to communities, to individuals, perhaps ourselves, and these are harms that are seen and unseen. We've hardly had time to take a step back and ask restorative questions about this global pandemic, like what has happened to us and why did it happen? What's going to have to happen to make it right? Who's been harmed by this pandemic, and how can we rebuild going forward? I don't have the answers to any of those questions. We're just trying to survive day to day right now. But to just give this some standing in our conversation today and acknowledge this reality, I'd like to just pause for about 30 seconds of personal reflection. Thank you for taking that moment of time with me, and I certainly wish you all and your community well. So a bit about where I'm coming from at University of North Carolina at Greensboro. I'm glad to have one of my colleagues with me on the session today, so thank you, Dr. Dyson, for joining. We are situated on the ancestral lands of the Kiowa Indians and the Saura Indians. We're founded in 1891 as a college for white women. That same year, there was a university in North Carolina established for Black Americans. In 1956, we admitted our first Black students and slowly integrated racially from there. And then in 1964, we integrated our first male students, bringing us to be a co-ed university as we are today. Today in 2021, we're designated as a minority serving institution, which means that 50% of our undergraduate students are from minority backgrounds, such as Black or Hispanic and Native American. 45% of our undergraduate students are also the first in their family to attend college. We have a classification from our government as or from the Carnegie system as a Research 2 university, which means we have a high level of research activity on campus. And we also have a community engagement classification from the Carnegie system. We're one of 40 universities in the United States to have both a research intensive classification and a community engagement classification. You can kind of see us located on a map here, somewhere in between New York and, say, Miami, Florida, in the mid-Atlantic region of the United States. I've shared a bit about the weather with you here. I looked at your weather in Bedfordshire. It looks quite nice today as well, if I saw it correctly. We're transitioning into spring weather here, and I'm looking forward to a nice walk later this afternoon after this meeting with you all. I want to mention a little bit about our public schools, because this is a partner, important partner with us in our scholarship. We're situated in Guilford County of North Carolina. It's the third largest school district in the state of North Carolina, with over 72,000 public school students, and that's spread across 122 individual schools. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the school district has lost contact with 11% of their students, and we are currently operating on a 2-day per week schedule with several public health restrictions in place. And so this is indicative of the types of harm that we are all experiencing as we try to see our way out of the global pandemic. So what is scholarship? And this was foundational to the title of the presentation. There's a traditional, or I think a prevailing approach to scholarship that centers research as the most important, most productive feature of the scholarly endeavor in higher education. And so methods-driven inquiry being the pathway to produce new knowledge. And under this kind of idea, the direction of knowledge flows from experts, perhaps like us, folks with PhDs and some level of expertise, and flows into professions and the communities. We disseminate that through our courses and through our professional service. It is most appreciated, I think, certainly in my culture, through the outcomes that research produces, journal publications, competitive grant awards, and other types of outcomes that will distinguish a person as doing very well in scholarship. So I'm influenced by this notion of engaged scholarship. And before I go into that, I want to acknowledge this is really, my understanding of this is driven by American institutions, including the Carnegie Foundation's classification system, the organization Campus Compact, and the organization called the Council of Urban and Metropolitan Universities. I'm less aware of what this conversation looks like in other international contexts outside of the United States, but I have a sense that there is some consistency in translation around this thinking. So an engaged approach to scholarship is different. And there's a seminal article by the engaged scholar Ernest Linton, which shapes my thinking in the presentation today. And a quote within reads that the domain of knowledge has no one-way streets. Knowledge does not move from the locus of research to the place of application, from scholar to practitioner, teacher to student, expert to client. It is everywhere fed back, constantly enhanced. He says we need to think of knowledge in an ecological fashion, recognizing the complex, multifaceted, and multiply connected systems by which means of discovery, aggregation, synthesis, dissemination, and application are all interconnected and interacting in a wide variety of ways. So in today's presentation, I want to talk about scholarship in this engaged paradigm that's a bit broader than this one directional flow of research. And under that paradigm, research certainly can exist and thrive under engaged scholarship. So this ecosystem of knowledge might create space for me as an expert in kinesiology, but also for people who bring other expertise, such as if I'm working in a community, persons who have expertise about, sorry about that. Okay, persons who have expertise about the history of that community, youth who have a perspective about what's happening in the community from the youth perspective, and so on. So there's other valid forms of knowledge to bring to bear under an engaged approach. Additionally, there's no clear, delineation between the roles of teaching, service, and research. So good scholarship can be seen across those roles, and the best scholarship probably is integrated across those roles. And I hope to illustrate that in the slides forward. The process, and I think this is important to me, the process of research is not so much a logistical process as we might think of it under a research paradigm, the logistics of collecting data, doing the things necessary to generate outcomes, but the process itself is a scholarly endeavor that can have rigor and can be recognized as having value separate from the outcomes that it may produce. And so within this, you can see diverse forms of dissemination beyond just the journal article, and centering the needs of communities. So I view this as a values-based approach, and I'm going to talk about this ethic of caring as the value within an engaged scholarship approach. I'm influenced by an article called "Confronting the Careless University" by engagement scholar Byron White in my thinking here. He has this article that I found provocative, and what he argues is that universities do not care about people. So UNC Greensboro, or University of Bedfordshire, does not care about people. And if you're like me, to hear that, if I say to you, your university doesn't care about people, you might feel a little bit squirmy and even defensive and want to say, oh, wait a minute. I mean, we do some outstanding work in communities, and we do indeed care deeply about communities. What he argued is that we're mission-driven institutions that are concerned with our deadlines, our academic calendars, our schedules, and our end goal that might grind against the democratic processes that are necessary to fully include and so-called care about the communities that we work within. So universities might care to the extent that it grinds against their mission. The reason you and I feel uncomfortable if I said our universities don't care about the communities is because we care about the communities, and we make sure to bring that forward in our scholarship. What Dr. White has argued is that engaged scholars center this ethic of care in their scholarship. And so how can we do that? What does that look like in scholarship? I'm going to offer three processes to consider under this idea of ethic of caring before moving to research. So the first one I want to talk about is the pursuit of scholarship that is mutually beneficial for university stakeholders and community stakeholders. In the best case scenarios, you might see something like highlighted in green here, scholarly outcomes that are highly impactful under the metrics that we might use in our university systems. Because we do indeed need to produce impactful, highly valued scholarship to be sustainable as scholars and to be able to work with our communities and to care about our communities. We have to be successful at the university. So how can we pursue those outcomes while also pursuing and realizing outcomes for community partners that are of high value and have a direct impact? I do think, as I've highlighted in yellow here, that we do a decent job at times in our discipline of kinesiology and physical activity areas of study with producing high impact scholarship with indirect impacts on communities. And so I've been a part of a number of research studies where we've gotten research grants and produce some publications that are scholarly valuable, and perhaps we provide some funding to a community that helps them with their goals or gets them some equipment for a physical education program. And I would view that as a indirect impact because that equipment and funding served our scholarly goals. It didn't serve a goal emanating from the community. I don't mean to suggest that that's not meaningful, because providing communities with resources and assets has an impact. But this idea of mutually benefit is centered on making sure both stakeholders have their central needs considered in the types of outcomes that we produce. I hope to provide examples before the presentation ends if that's not clear. The second element of this engaged approach to scholarship, and I'm influenced by a colleague of mine at UNCG in this thinking, Dr. Emily Yankee, and she has written about this concept of reciprocity. And this is a process-based concept in research, this idea that the process of generating these outcomes is of equal importance, and there is scholarly rigor to consider within the reciprocal process. So there's multiple ways that we conduct research. And if you think about it in this cone of reciprocity, there are times where we might do research on communities, do things to communities to learn things about a research question, do things for communities to help with a need, perhaps as a charitable purpose. And then there are examples of doing things with communities. So involving people as key stakeholders, decision makers in the design and conceptualization of research. At the top of this cone of reciprocity, this idea of doing research with communities is the most time-consuming, messy, and complicated process. And so one of the challenges for engaged scholars, and I think for universities who aim to care, so to speak, is to think about how do we make reciprocity visible? How do we make it subject to peer review? And how do we make it such that it can be appreciated as a scholarly process, so people like you and I can pursue reciprocal relationships with communities. So the third concept, and this might be an example of reciprocity or help shed light on that concept of reciprocity, is that we should pursue scholarship that centers community identified concerns and sometimes decenters the concerns or questions that I might have as a disciplinary scholar of kinesiology. So for me, when I go out to my communities where I do research over the past few years here in Greensboro, the types of concerns that are central to them include things like you see on the screen. So they're concerned about the school to prison pipeline, where minority students in America are overrepresented in school suspensions and then more likely to interact with the criminal justice system and ultimately have a higher risk of being imprisoned as adults. There are racial disparities in academic outcomes in American schools, and I know these are global issues as well. And then there's just issues with how public services are made available to young people and who gets access to those services. Communities talk about responses to these being preferable to provide charity, to address these responses, to donate things or do some things that are helpful and meaningful, but are also apathetic toward the notion of justice that would be transformative in changing these types of things. And then finally, I hear a lot about deficit-oriented approaches to scholarship and to communities in general when we think about young people. And so that's not an exhaustive list of the things that community members are concerned about, but it's representative. And when you look at that list of community identified concerns, one of the things that's clear is it's not, there are no answers to those problems that are within a single discipline. There are certainly not answers to those problems within kinesiology, where I am situated, or in physical education or sports psychology, et cetera, as many of us identify. And so these are fundamentally interdisciplinary problems that extend beyond the knowledge base that any university can bring to bear. And so it calls for processes to include community members in the thinking, in the scholarly reciprocal process of determining how we investigate these problems, how we respond to these problems, and who should be included. So those are some of the values under that ethic of care. So pursuing scholarship that has mutual benefit, reciprocal processes, and grounding scholarship in community identified concerns. So let me shift a little bit here to talk about my research frame that I think offers me something specific as an area of inquiry, but offers us all a kind of paradigm and a way of thinking about how we approach our work in universities and how we approach communities. And that's this idea of restorative justice, which is a topic that is increasingly gaining attention internationally. I know I've read a bit coming out of European countries around this topic, and we see it here in America and beyond. So as an idea, restorative justice, as activist Fania Davis explains in the quote here, she says of the American system of justice, and this includes, criminal justice as well as schools, because schools are a system of social justice. She says our systems of justice harm people who harm people, presumably to show them that harming people is wrong. And so restorative justice is seeking to interrupt these cycles by repairing damage done to relationships in this sequential harm that's being placed on communities. Restorative justice is instead a healing ground instead of a battleground. And so it's fundamentally concerned with harm, with conflict, but also broader harm that goes beyond just interpersonal conflict. I like to think about, with this being centered in the notion of harm, where is harm coming from when we want to deal with this? So the most commonly recognized area is going to be interpersonal harm. A lot of the conversation around restorative justice in schools will talk about bullying, conflicts between students, and how do we give them personal and social skills to navigate those and reduce those conflicts. But it can't really be separated. The interpersonal harm can't be separated from institutional practices, policies, and power structures that would dole out punishment in schools, that would set policies in schools, that adopt curriculum in schools. And this still can't be separated from systemic types of harms that goes beyond one particular context and might cross generations. And so one of the things I encourage when we think about this is to think about these as interconnected. As a university, when I go out to communities, there are times at which community members are concerned about my presence, not because of me, but because of the history of my university as an institution that in its past has excluded people and not always been responsive to certain communities. So even though I was not a part of that institution who caused that harm, I'm a part of that today, and I've inherited that. So I have to think about these institutional and systemic levels as much as interpersonal. Now, as pedagogy scholars, one of the things I try to think about with restorative justice is we have to position ourselves to be able to understand restorative justice in context where it might exist, and how do we navigate conversations and help individuals understand the different harms that are taking place. And so education scholar Maisha Wynn offers what she calls pedagogical stances that we need to consider when we go out into communities. And again, she's really drawing on a base of scholarship from American schools. And she talks about the need to consider history, race, justice, and language as 4 things that matter when we go into communities of practice. And so in that example I just gave, if I go into a community representing my university, I need to be concerned about the history of that community and its relationship to my university, the race of that community, the social justice issues that they're dealing with, and then the frames at which we discuss that community in deficit-oriented or asset-based ways. The second area, so if that's kind of a philosophical overview of how you might think about restorative justice, you can also think about restorative justice as a set of practices or processes that aim to include everyone to the extent possible, people who are impacted by harm, to include them in a process to determine the appropriate responses to harm and promote healing. Some examples are the restorative justice conferencing process, which is applied to criminal justice situations, offender reintegration situations. It can deal with victim recovery absent offenders if that isn't possible. And then it's commonly seen in school punishment. So if a kid gets sent to the principal's office type of thing to determine what the appropriate punishment will be. It is also popularly applied to community healing processes, such as truth and reconciliation processes. My community in Greensboro, North Carolina, is the only community to have a truth and reconciliation commission that's grounded in the community and not commissioned by a government, such as the truth and reconciliation process in, say, South Africa or in Canada. These processes can help build institutional memory when generations have passed, and we need to understand how our institution has harmed communities in years past. And so that kind of addresses this notion of generational harm. So now, most relevant to my work and what we're talking about today for the rest of the presentation is this idea of restorative practices that emanate from restorative justice. These ideas can be proactive. They're not necessarily in response to a conflict or harm occurring. They are associated with social emotional learning in schools. And the most common practice that pedagogical practice associated with this is the circle process. And this is this idea of having young people sit in a circle where everyone's provided a chance to speak to a question that can address issues of harm, of culture, or even to simply teach the curriculum that you may be pursuing. This is a promising area, but is the least established approach in this idea of restorative justice. So I think, you know, this conversation has been happening, say, for the past 10 years or so, whereas this idea of conferencing emerged in the 1970s. Okay, so I'm going to give three examples of engaged scholarship, and I'll give a more brief overview of the research, in part to make sure we have time, and I'm trying to put this in the umbrella of engaged scholarship, but I'd like to give three examples of studies, all of which are forthcoming in Journal of Teaching and Physical Education. So my first foray into this was to study a restorative, what's defined as a restorative school in New Zealand. I was inspired to do this because Howard Zehr, who's a restorative justice scholar, had said at a conference once that if you wanted to see what restorative justice could look like in the United States 20 years from now, you'd go to New Zealand today, because they had established restorative justice in schools. And so we talked about this idea of kind of try to see into the future, what can you learn about restorative justice in New Zealand, where they have restorative schools that could be transferable to restorative justice in the United States, specifically related to physical education, physical activity. So we really went to New Zealand, spent a couple of years going back and forth to try to understand how is restorative justice evident in restorative, in what they call restorative schools, and conducted a qualitative case study at one school in Wellington, New Zealand. To summarize the findings and lessons learned, we identified some teaching strategies that are well established in physical education and coaching context. The most prominent were the idea of youth empowerment, things like giving youth leadership roles in physical education, and then using a variety of relational strategies that you might associate with cooperative learning types of strategies. So although these are established in physical education, these were attributed to their restorative justice pedagogy at the restorative school. They also use this idea of restorative chats as kind of an informal, quick manner to address conflicts and harms that were occurring. And there was limited use of the popular restorative circle method, due in part to its time intensiveness and the preference for maximizing physical activity time. We observed that there were a lot of interpersonal conflicts occurring, and these were all unique to sport. in physical education. I think this is a key takeaway. And so bullying or taunting based on a person's physical skills, these are things that aren't happening in the math or English classroom. They're unique to PE, suggesting that restorative might have a place in this space. The types of harm extended beyond physical education, such as social media platforms where students could be away from adults and continue this taunting, bullying type of behavior. A quote from the article reads, one of the influential takeaways was that the physical educator was commonly described by all stakeholders as either the central figure in causing harm, resolving conflicts, or creating a positive climate. So this idea of restorative justice really needs to think more about the role of adults in concert with promoting personal responsibility among youth. The second study, so now I'm kind of returned back to the United States and was aware that in 2014, under the Barack Obama administration, there were civil rights mandates for several school districts to reform their discipline practices. And restorative justice was suggested as the appropriate way to do that. So a lot of schools were all of a sudden adopting restorative justice. We were contacted, myself and a colleague, by a first-year physical education teacher who was in one of these schools that had all of a sudden kind of taken on restorative justice. And this was problematic because he had not had the training and skills necessary to take this on. So we tried to do an action research type of approach to provide him with some professional development and support as he navigated this process. In the school that we're talking about, the year prior to the study, about 38% of the students had been suspended from school for conflicts. During the year of the study, less than 1% were suspended. So that was the drastic reduction driven by the restorative justice process. The findings offer really a cautionary tale, and it's problematic how this is adopted at times in schools. There was significant classroom management challenges that were really overwhelming to this teacher because the harm was not addressed or resolved at the administrative level. So in other words, conflicts would occur, but were not solved and sent back to the classroom. We documented several critical incidents where severe disruptions would end class for the day. The teacher was not involved in the restorative process, so he did not have a way to understand what harm was caused, what was going to be done to help students recover from that situation. And we observed significant physical and emotional harm in the classroom that went unaddressed. So clearly, there was this lack of training from pre-service through induction for this teacher, and we highlight that significant support is required, professional development to implement restorative pedagogy. And without that, it can be a harmful practice. So I encourage people to adopt this, but we have to do things the right way when we do restorative justice. The final study I want to highlight for a conversation today is a study that I've led with a community partner here in Greensboro, North Carolina, and with assistance from a doctoral student and undergraduate student. So recognizing that we needed to understand what does classroom-based restorative justice look like for PE, we've established our own restorative justice-based physical education program in which we are the physical education teacher twice per week at a public high school. And we've implemented this, I think, 5 terms now with 24 to 32 lessons each term. One strength that we have is that we have 90 minutes in the PE class. So we can start off the class with a restorative circle, have plenty of time for physical activity, and still have time to finish the class with the restorative circle. We also have some training from an international organization that is reputable in this area to try to give some assurance to our restorative justice implementation. So one finding, I'll just highlight one finding from this study here today around the pedagogy that was evident in the program. over 2 years, so this would be 4 terms, about 75 students would have participated in the study with the paper that's forthcoming. So we saw this use of restorative chats that was documented from New Zealand schools, and then we also identified the use of consistent circle practices taking place, and we're able to identify kind of what those look like. And there's listening circles where students are given an open-ended question and provided a chance to listen to their peers' experiences and dialogue in that manner. And then there was this idea of community circles that were designed to build common understanding around identities, culture, community standards, welcoming new members to the community, and things like that. The most important finding for me is this notion of healing circles, because restorative justice is about healing and harm. So in this school, we were able to hold several of these healing circles to address harm that was happening in the community and in the school. This included the death of classmates. This included a number of different challenges, but these other circles were really a prerequisite to this healing circle practice. So a space for healing cannot emerge because harm has occurred in public schools. I would suggest a space for healing has to be cultivated proactively before that harm occurs. One thing that was striking to me is that giving the space of circles that we created, there was an incident which the school provided counselors to students to help them navigate harm, but the counseling was not established beforehand. So the students who had been in circles with us came to a healing circle to address that, because that prerequisite was established. So I encourage proactive approach thinking about restorative justice. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up with a few slides around this. I wanted to talk about a bigger picture of engaged scholarship and not just specific studies. So I hope you appreciate my more brief overview than I might in a research presentation. So returning to this idea of engaged scholarship in kinesiology. So I've talked about these different elements, and the first being restorative justice. This process provided me with a lens to work in an underrepresented community where my university has not always had a presence. And I was able, through this restorative justice circle processes, to think about the history of that relationship and understand the kind of more long-term approach to scholarship that was needed to build the trust and relationships to do more authentic restorative justice scholarship. It also provides a lens to think about race and the ways that restorative justice is applied to different communities and schools. For example, the literature here shows that restorative justice in the United States in a minority school is likely to be responsive or reactive. So that means students get restorative justice once they've gotten in trouble already. Whereas in suburban majority white schools, restorative justice is more likely to be proactive, where they're building these spaces of healing and harm that I talked about in the previous slide beforehand. So we can't understand that without thinking about these concepts and trying to pursue social justice to change that. The final area around language that I've learned is the language that places burdens on individuals versus the language that places burdens on institutions. In American schools, we often see this. The best example I can think of is the achievement gap rhetoric, which suggests that underachieving students, who are often lower class students and often minority students, really need to work harder to bring up their level of achievement to middle and upper class students, who often are better resourced to achieve. We do not hear language that talks about the funding gap that shapes that achievement, or the lack of opportunities in certain schools that shapes that achievement, which is noteworthy because the language of achievement speaks to a person's responsibility to try harder and to overcome, whereas the language of funding and opportunity speaks to an institution's responsibility to serve its citizens, to serve the public. Quite frankly, it speaks to adults like me, who are members of the community and responsible for, for providing public services. And so I think that's problematic. Second is this idea of process. I think you can see in my research experience, I argue this to my colleagues and have gained some support, that the process of scholarship is a rigorous scholarly outcome in and of itself, separate from the outcomes that we might produce. So separate from the journal articles. And I'll just highlight one, being the sustained relationships idea. So some relationships in scholarship are hard to earn, and some are more easy to earn. There's plenty of incentives for me to choose a different high school to do this work within, because I could do it much faster. I'd have more publications, and it would be less messy. But it means something to have relationships and communities that are underrepresented, that are experiencing harm, and have reason to distrust the university. It means something to build trust with those universities, and that does indeed have scholarly value. So I think the challenge for us as kinesiology professionals is to think about, how do we make this visible? How do we make this an idea that can be systematically pursued, communicated in the same manner that we can appreciate the outcomes of scholarship? So I think one of the ways I've been able to do that in my work is that I can indicate the outcomes. I think there's a lot of outstanding community engaged scholars who do the process work really well. And because it's not visible in terms of how do we see process and appreciate it, it can't be fully appreciated until we get the outcomes. So when the outcomes come, the process can become more visible. In my world, I've been able to do that by demonstrating the high scholarly impact through traditional outlets like publications, but the direct community development as well, like providing infrastructure for restorative justice practice in minority schools, providing curriculum reform in physical education, and things that are directly beneficial to communities. I think a way for us to think about this is to look at how we define our roles in kinesiology. So I have a research assignment, teaching assignment, and a service assignment by my university, divided up in percentages. And we often think about these things, and it's like we're three different people, and there's this person who does research, and somebody else who teaches, and somebody else who does some service. When I think about my scholarship, there's no clear delineation across those. It's an integrated approach, and the research would really be impossible without that integrated capacity. In fact, when we are able to integrate this and have research combined with doctoral training, with undergraduate training, integrated in courses, and then deeply embedded in communities through service and other types of engagement, we create broader capacity to do the scholarship that we're interested in doing. So this approach, in my view, where community-based knowledge is central, is irreplaceable and deserves some standing in our discipline. So I'm going to ask kind of reflective questions to close out here for stewards of kinesiology, and as professionals in the discipline, we certainly are that. What is the public mission of kinesiology? Is there a public mission? I'm reminded that the discipline of kinesiology is born out of physical education, which clearly has a public mission, because we're training teachers to work in largely public schools. We've moved some way. We have a broader discipline. It's diverse, it's rich in its different practices, but what is the public mission at its core of kinesiology? Who is represented within kinesiology and served by our scholarship? Who is left out, and why? And what problems does that cause? what drives our scholarship and determines what work is valued or not? Is it the outcomes? Are we thinking about the process? Are we thinking about communities? Is there an ethic of caring? So those are some fundamental questions I think we need to pursue. I'll offer my final thoughts, and I want to lift up the engaged scholar Ernest Linton, and I found this persuasive. He says that in no other profession does the dissemination of knowledge play as central a role as it does in scholarship. Indeed, an identification of teaching in its broadest sense with scholarship comes closer to being a valid description than the more prevalent identification with research. So I'll use pedagogy instead of teaching, but I found that provocative and persuasive, that the idea of pedagogy comes closer to the true definition of scholarship than the idea of research comes to the true definition of scholarship. If we believe that to be true, then I think that is different from the ways our universities operate today. But I think our research, as impactful and meaningful as it is, it's bound by its methods, and it's bound by the criteria for inclusion for folks who have to get the PhD to have a seat at the table. And it's often bound by our disciplines, where we find it hard to cross over to connect to others who might help us address complex problems. There's also hierarchies that would make it very difficult for community members to be involved, truly involved as scholars under that umbrella of research. Whereas when we think about pedagogy as teaching and learning broadly, there can be a place for research in that, because it's a process of generating new knowledge that's well established. But teaching and learning is fundamentally for everyone, I think. Everybody has a place for contributing. It also might position us as scholars as we go into communities and try to care about communities as persons who have more to learn from them than we do to offer them. And again, I'm reminded of that slide around community identified concerns, where I might feel like I'm a smart person with some skills, but when I show up and someone is concerned about the school to prison pipeline or academic achievement in schools, I really have a limited skill set to offer. Although it's valuable, it's a limited skill set and can only be meaningful if capacity is built from others through collaboration and community, collaboration with community. So those are my thoughts about the questions for kinesiology, and I know we'll have just a little bit of time. I'd love to hear yours now or in the future, and just thanks again for bringing me into this space today.
Thanks very much, Michael. Big virtual round of applause for that. I'm certainly having lots of thoughts. I want to open it up to questions. So audience, feel free to unmute and ask a question, or to post it into the chat. Either way, the floor is open. We've got a few minutes left for some questions. While we're waiting for anybody else, I've got a question for you. I'm going to go first. Where was my question? I did write it down. I was interested in the kinds of PE curriculum, like the curriculum content, which is offered you said the program had a restorative circle at the beginning, and then you'd go into your PE curriculum time and then do a restorative circle at the end. Was there any mindful sort of designing of the PE curriculum? Was it following a standard structure, or was it doing something specific that might have been related also to that fitted in with this kind of thinking as well?
Yeah, yes, it did. I borrowed a lot from Hellison's idea of teaching responsibility here with these kind of levels of responsibility. So we typically would have a theme. One theme, for example, is the idea of a peacemaker. and opening circles might talk about what it means to be a peacemaker and explore exemplars of who is a peacemaker, what does peacemaking look like in school, etc. We used a Taekwondo curriculum. We have my doctoral student's a Taekwondo instructor, and would often put students in positions where they can explore that topic through the physical activity. And then we try to return to that same theme at the end of the lesson to bring it back together. So that's a bit about how we navigated that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions from the audience?
Do you
Hi,
mind
Ben.
if I chime in? Hi,
Yeah,
how you doing?
Hi.
Greetings everyone from North Carolina and just down the road from Michael. Kia ora, Michael. Great presentation and thanks for sharing your wonderful ideas. It's pretty innovative and I think very encouraging. So one of my questions is very specific, and I know I'm going to have a chat to you once we get a chance in more detail. But the restorative practice stuff in Aotearoa, New Zealand, you talked about. I know you talked about working with Fazetta there and the restorative practice program that they were doing. And you mentioned things like cooperative learning, but also it brings me back to Emily's, Yankees notion of reciprocity. Can you just talk a little bit about the pedagogy there? Because that's what I'm really interested in. And yeah, I'll let you shoot for that. Cheers.
Yeah, so restorative pedagogy in New Zealand.
Yes.
Okay. So as I understand it, there in around 1991, there was a law called the Suspension Reduction Act passed in New Zealand, and this was to address suspension of Maori students from school. So very similar to what we're seeing in US now. And so they used restorative conferencing for that. Shortly, in the years that followed, I think the teachers in New Zealand, really pointed out that, this is, good pedagogy means that you try to be restorative all the time, not just when there's a problem. And that in fact, restorative justice as a kind of a modern technique is grounded in indigenous practices, such as that of the Maori. So it would be appropriate to think about this more holistically. And so that's where you saw this broadening of restorative justice to a school-wide approach. So I've described it as like a tier. So at the bottom tier, you might think of school-wide restorative processes that would try to make visible a person's culture, would really acknowledge the dynamics of harm and the types of conflicts that students need to navigate. And then there can be at the second tier, that classroom-based pedagogy. And so that's where you see restorative circles that can they don't have to be about harm. They might be about, I've observed an English teacher lead a circle around the book that they're reading, but they also tend to have a relational base to them where every student has a voice. And so a traditional circle, you might have a talking piece where it goes around the circle to every single person, every single student has a voice in that process. So the voice pedagogy is really important here. Then the final point I'll mention, just to keep it brief, is that the pedagogy is really about being responsive to harm and not dodging or avoiding harm. There is an instinct, I think, to kind of avoid conflict, but restorative justice is really about acknowledging it and embracing that as a space to make relationships stronger and more sustainable. And so circle processes and restorative chats are examples of how that's done. And that can then escalate to that third tier, which is a more intensive process of restorative justice conferencing that is not always outside the classroom, but typically might be someone who's trained in restorative justice at like an administrator level.
Kia ora, mate.
Thank you.
We've got a question written in the chat from Alex, I believe, and she says, you mentioned during the second stage of the research, engaging or working with an early career teacher. What challenges did they have and how were they supported in developing their restorative justice pedagogy?
Yeah, the big challenge here is how do you find your footing with doing restorative justice if you're kind of starting without a context that where it's been cultivated for restorative justice to emerge. What we tried to do, recognizing that there wasn't a school level support system, we created a program where we did myself, another scholar, and this teacher did some shared reading and responding to reading together. And we engaged with some podcasts around restorative justice and developed an idea with the teacher of what he thought was possible in terms of restorative justice given the challenges he was facing. Those tended to be things like restorative chats and relational type strategies that could be implemented more one-on-one with students. He didn't perceive that there was a context to do restorative circle processes given the discipline challenges that he was seeing. Because what was happening, this is something we've seen in the United States, is to use restorative justice as a way to reduce punishment without ever addressing the context of harm that occurred in the first place. And so when you do that, then students are returning to the classroom perhaps even more fired up than they were in the first place. And those conflicts escalate. And you can imagine how hard that would be on any teacher, but a first-year teacher especially. So that's an area that I think just needs significant attention in terms of practice and scholarship.
Thanks very much. Danny, did you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Joan. That's very intuitive. Michael, thank you so much for that insight into your work and some of the fantastic things that you're working on at the moment. I come from a background of physical education and specifically outdoor and adventurous activities. And I'm mindful that pioneered in America in the 1980s, it reminded me of a book called Islands of Healing that used adventure for building communities and still is influential to this day. There's a couple of things I'd just like to ask you. Do you think that outdoor and adventurous activities and residential experiences have some part to play in moving forward? Because some of us in the UK think that these practices are becoming obscured a little bit and distanced from mainstream physical education. And the second part of the question would be to ask you what skill sets that you think newly qualified teachers and training teachers need in order to facilitate healing experiences.
Yeah, thank you. So when you mentioned outdoor adventure education, the thing that comes to mind that we might be losing track of with this is that connection to indigenous practice, which restorative justice emanates, has kind of been modernized and applied in different ways. And I think we are losing track of the essence of it in spaces. So I'm struck by the notion of connectivity to land and relationship to land and history that's found in indigenous practice, and how that might connect to these ideas of outdoor education and helping youth understand their responsibility to be responsible in the context of a community. So I'd be interested in thinking more about that in physical education and restorative justice. I haven't done much myself with that in this space, but I think that's an area that you raised that deserves some attention. In terms of skill set and practice, so one thing is just having some training that is proximal to the context in which you are going to work. We're seeing a lot of people who are trained and they do their student teaching in a suburban school, and then they go off into an urban school to teach, and they're just different experiences. So one, we just need experience in that area. There's also a real need for kind of cultural competence to work in this space, to understand the different experiences that youth have. When we think about harm and healing, sometimes I think the teacher might want to use strategies to resolve harm or to kind of punish students that are not consistent with the way they would be punished at home or how they would be expected to behave at home. And this is in part a root of some of the disparities we see in America, where Black students are more likely to be suspended from school for subjective offenses like talking too loud or things that can be deeply embedded in culture. So some sense of cultural relevance is needed And then I think, thinking about the early career teacher, it's hard to let go of power, especially early in your career. So the ability to empower youth to have a voice in the process and to kind of let go of things is important. Final thing I want to mention is that there is an instinct among teachers to want to have restorative justice for the young people, but not for the old people, which is striking because it would seem that the adults should be more accountable for what's happening in a school than the young people, because it's developmentally appropriate that youth will misbehave. But we have to think about what is our responsibility as adults for the outcomes that we're seeing take place. So that includes, at that institutional level, in my view, teachers who are responsible for classroom management, school administrators, but even people in the broader community, voters who elect school boards, who oversee these problems where there's these racial disparities taking place. So restorative justice often zooms in on young people and bypasses the adults who are actually responsible for making sure young people can thrive. So yeah, I appreciate that question. I'd love to, I'll be thinking about that further. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. We've reached the hour, so I think it just remains for me to say thanks so much again for Michael for this really thought-provoking presentation. And I want to express my pleasure at seeing everybody here in our session as well today. So to anyone who is a member of the Centre for PE, Sport and Human Movement, if there's any other speakers that you would like us to get in as part of the ISPAR seminar series, then drop me a line and we'll try to pursue that for you. Yeah, thanks very much, Michael, and to all of our attendees. And I'll say good afternoon, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.